Hello, everyone. This is Spellbound, and today we have Petter Olsson, one of our locals, who won the recent Battle Hardened in Valencia with his SAge Chane deck. This will be his deck tech. Welcome, Petter.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here, excited to go through the deck, talk through some of the card choices and the philosophy of the deck, the general thoughts on SAge as a format, where it might be going, where it's at right now, and also some of the things that kind of ended up with us capturing lightning in the bottle a little bit with the deck. I think a lot of things worked out the way I envisaged them, and in some other ways I got quite lucky with how the meta and what people ended up bringing there, which made the deck, I think, very well suited to the Battle Hardened. But I think there's a little bit of interesting history behind the deck, which is that way before we even knew this format was called Silver Age, when it had just been announced with the Project Blue, we had a league here at Spellbound Games. And this is when Old Knocker was still legal. Everybody was running this. Every value deck was running Fiddler's Green, all these kinds of things. But we had a local league where most people just were bringing a new deck every week. Everyone was cooking up different things. It was a very kind of exciting time where everybody was testing different things. And I think right towards the end of the league, I had an idea because my first real CC deck when I started playing about a year and a few months ago was Vincent. So I wanted to bring Chane because when I just started playing the game, I played it with my housemate with the Chane Blitz deck. So I wanted to give it a go, and I thought maybe the Chane could be suited to the format. I didn't have much faith in him. I thought it's probably too clunky. I thought probably the RuneGate stuff isn't going to work that well. Maybe it doesn't block well enough. And it was right towards the end of the league when the winner had already been locked. So I thought, well, I'll just bring it. We'll see what happens. And despite having a really kind of unoptimized, messy deck with lots of weird choices and things that didn't quite work out, the deck was still capable of producing incredibly powerful turns towards endgame or whenever it managed a high roll. So I ended up kind of taking this deck when me, my housemate, and some other people had decided to go to the Battle Hardened in Valencia for the SAge and trying to refine it, particularly with my housemate Marcus, who is sort of my main testing partner and the person I spend 99% of my playtime in Fab with. We ended up kind of refining the deck, trying to narrow it down to the things that really worked, trying to work on the kind of philosophies and the principles that made the deck very powerful, trying to cut out the things that made it a bit clunkier or that ended up kind of sinking the deck. So I think some of the kind of guiding principles of the deck came from the SAge League or the PB League that we had here and another SAge army we had at P9 Games, where we were very regularly testing out the things that were powerful in SAge. So I thought that what seemed very likely to be the meta coming into the Battle Hardened Valencia was Chane. So this deck needed to be good in the mirror. Briar, it needed to be good into that kind of horrendous sort of burn-up shock, lightning press, all-out aggro. Fi, Ira, it needed to be good into the kind of Kodachi 1 to 2 blues a turn, really regular value, Kodachi Sirens kind of value play. And it needed to be good into Bravo, Flattering Showman, as the kind of aggressive Guardian archetype that was able to produce lots of evasive damage and that was able to force people to basically not play too slowly into the deck or you would simply die. And also into the kind of old him, kind of block slop, clash of yellow 4-block style of deck. So I thought these were the ones that we were most likely to see. So the decisions that kind of ended up informing the deck was a focus on a few things. So I think the probably first point of comparison most people will make is with the deck that won the Japanese SAge event that they had. It was about a week before the Battle Hardened. And I think obviously we seem to have reached quite a few very similar conclusions. One of them is that RuneGate is incredibly powerful. It's so strong because you're turning every rune chant you make into not just one resource, but also one damage. And it's not just one damage, but it's one split damage. So you're essentially forcing decks to commit the resource cards to trying to prevent you from just completely aggroing them down. The other conclusion that we reached, I think similarly, is that approximately 12 to 14 RuneGate / playable from banished cards seem to be about correct. It puts you at about 1 1/3 chance of banishing with the Soul Shackle a card you can play from your banish zone. I think this ratio felt approximately correct because that is about the rate at which you can empty your banish zone as well. And because you're trying to cover a really wide spread of matchups, I think that felt like the kind of nicest balance that we ended up with. So a few of the principles where I ended up, or we ended up refining the deck to, was looking at the cost curve of the deck. So I think we're going to get into this more specifically when we look at the individual cards. But broadly speaking, this deck much prefers 2 costs to 3 costs. I think reaching 2 rune chance to send something from Banish Zone is much easier than finding 3. We still play a few of the 3 costs because they're just too good not to play. And there's too good into the stack matchups as the kind of thing that you lead with in your big kind of going wide turn. So this was one of the principles of the deck. It's trying to be lean, it's trying to be flexible, it's trying to have lots of hands, textures it can convert either on defense or offense. So we're going to also get into some of the buffs that I'm playing. I think lots of people are playing Envelop in Darkness. I don't personally like this card. I think it's too conditional. I think it also blocks 2. Similarly with Beseech the Demigon and these kinds of cards, they're very good if you have the correct setup for them, but they're not good enough if you don't. I think broadly speaking, Chane is a deck that you're trying to raise the floor of because the ceiling is already so high. You don't really need help raising the ceiling. And what we then ended up trying to do is have a main board and a sideboard that kind of ends up covering as much of the spread as possible. I think the deck actually has a few uniquely bad matchups, but they are largely decks which were not represented because they have really horrendous matchups into other popular decks. But I think that's something we can get into. So then going through the kind of deck itself, we obviously have Chane. Chane's hero ability is incredibly powerful. It's so broken. It gives the next Runeblade or Shadow action go again, and it creates a Soul Shackle. I think either of these things by itself would make Chane quite a good deck, but the fact that it does both is just creates these situations where you are able to create wide turns, forcing your opponent to give up cards, while you're also producing Soul Shackles, which in effect essentially put you at a significant card advantage. And the longer the game goes, the more things you're going to banish from the top of your deck, the more free cards you're going to get, because it essentially means that you're just extending your hand every single turn. So Chane's ability is very powerful. I think into almost all matchups, you want to start shackling aggressively and shackling early. I think there's a few ones where you don't have the pressure to do it, particularly into Oldhim and much slower decks, where you don't want to banish your Malefics and things like this off the top. But generally, you want to like aggressively shackle. It's a 20 life format. If you can chain together 3 to 4 of these powerful 2 wide, 3 wide turns, there's no deck in the game that can kind of compete with it. For the weapon choice, we have Reaping Blade. Originally, I was playing Nebula Blade because I think it's a really cool weapon. I think the 2/4 make a rune chant sounds really nice, but it ends up being too conditional on being able to play a non-attack action to boost up the attack value. And also the 1/3 curve is just so much better in a deck which plays this many 2 costs, which also has Bloodthorn Bodis, which we're going to get into. And it also creates a situation where, because you're often going down in life early in the game, the text on Reaping Blade is actually surprisingly relevant. So you have people being unable to convert, for example, arcane polarities early in the game and things like this that they will often bring into you. Incredibly powerful weapon. For the headpiece, we have Ebonfold. I wouldn't play anything else. I think this is also an incredibly powerful headpiece. It's really flexible. It's really good for converting hands. It's really strong into aggro if they're going first, because if you end up drawing one of your reduced to rune chants, you can pop the Ebonfold for a resource, banish something, which means you're essentially banking a card you can play for the next turn. It's kind of like an arsenal. You also get a resource. You can then play your reduced to rune chants, and then you can make rune chants, so you're activating all of your really powerful abilities. It also helps you with, you can save it for late in the game to go wide. And it's also very good into the Kano matchups. I don't think there were any Kanos in the Valencia Battle Hardened, but that's one of the deck's kind of weirdly bad matchups because it's just a little bit too slow to be able to properly compete with Kano. The Bloodthorn Bodis, it's the only chest piece that we play. It's really strong. It has lots of synergies within the deck, particularly with Arcane Cussing, which we're going to get into later. I have 2 of those in the main board. I think it's so strong. But also it has synergies with Reaping Blade, with Ebonfold, where because you are constantly making Soul Shackles and Rune Chants, you have lots of resources that you can pop for the 1 resource if you need it. One of the most common play patterns that you're going to see into really aggressive decks is that you end up making lots of Rune Chants, and then you can insulate yourself right towards endgame, where say Fi or Briar is on very low life, they don't bring AB into you. So you can insulate yourself against missing all of your banishes. You can still block your whole hand, pop a Soul Shackle with Bloodthorn Bodis, swing Reaping Blade, and then your Rune Chants will just kill them. We have Runehold Release. This is sort of Vexing Quillhand at home. As much as we wish we could have Vexing Quillhand, it would obviously be way too powerful for the format. Making one Rune Chant is often the difference between being able to send a Rune Gate or not from your banish zone. So if you have, for example, one Malefic up, you're able to just, with one Malefic and 2 Rune Chants at the start of your turn, you're able to go 2 wide if you have 2 cost in your banish zone. I also very frequently pop this if I go first into aggro. So I'll play, for example, some setup, but if I don't have any Rune Chant generation, or I'm just playing Malefics and setting up for a later turn, I will often pop this just to make sure I have a Rune Chant on board for their first turn in case I draw any reduced to Rune Chants, so I can just play them for free. In terms of the legs, we have 2 very obvious choices. Everyone who plays SAge is familiar with these. Blade Beckoners, really good. Even into matchups where they're not likely to swing the weapon, they're still really good. They form a really important part of the deck's ability to protect itself against snatches. So you can put this on a 3 cost if you don't have any 4 blocks. Into some of the Guardians, you're able to cover a Boulder Drop with this and a 3 cost, and not a 3 cost, and a 3 block card. So I think Blade Beckoner is obviously very powerful. They're worth 2. Defense into most matchups, they're very good. And then we have Null Rune Boots as the only AB in the deck. Null Rune is for the Chain Mirror, for Icelander, for Kano. And you just typically tend to bring it into those matchups, but it's particularly important for the Mirror, where I think being able to stop whales and things like this from triggering their on-damage effects is quite strong. Also, it's good at preventing arcane castings from popping. So that was kind of the equipment. I think when we move into the RuneGate cards, so this is the attack actions that are playable from Banish that the deck plays up here. So as I said, the kind of general principle of the deck is to try to focus primarily on 2 costs, and also 0 costs in the case of Bounding Demagon. So we do have 2, 3 costs in the deck. There are Whales and Banshees. So one of the things I've written in my notes here is that Whales are bad. And I think this is broadly true and was broadly true in my testing. I think the red whale is really good. It's a 3 for 6 that makes a rune chant. It's incredibly powerful on the turns where you can lead with it, on turns where you're expecting to go wide. Because again, the rest of the deck is very focused around 2 costs. So just 1 Malefic, or even just a whale, if you're able to do damage and then pop the Runehold Release, you're able to go a little bit wider. In a 20 life format into aggressive decks, you're able to just convert your hand really cleanly and put them in a position where they need to start blocking you. At which point they just tend to lose. The 2 costs, as you can see, also generally help with kind of converting your whole hand. So we have the Deathly Whales, we have the Van Tom Banshees. Banshees are in the deck because they're just a 3 for 7. That breakpoint is really important. It ends up being very powerful into slightly slower matchups. It's very hard for most decks to cover up that kind of damage. And I think 3 for 7 is just like a really good rate when you're sending it for free from your banish zone. So in a kind of typical example, if you're ever able to start your turn on 3 rune chants and you have a Banshee to send, you're generally going to have a very good turn. Then we also have some of the classic 2 costs. We have Phantom Wraiths, Deathly Delights. Both of these are essentially 2 for 6. So Phantom Wraith, just a classic textless 2 for 6 rune gate. Some of the most powerful, but also kind of quote-unquote vanilla turns that you're going to have with Chane generally involves a Phantom Wraith into another rune gate. They generally involve having 2 Malefics on board and 2 rune chants on board, and sending these. While 2 for 6 is a pretty common rate, when you're able to send them for free, it's a very good rate. When you're able to send them where the resources that you pay are also damage, it's an incredible rate. It's very powerful. Bounding Demigons, I think this is one of the kind of things where the list diverges from slightly more control-heavy lists. I personally think this card is incredible. It's very strong on turns where you want to go 3 wide, but you don't have the rune chance for the third thing that you want to send. Because Malefics only trigger once every turn, because you only have 1 piece of go again, usually with Chane. It ends up being a situation where something like a 3 cost into a 2 cost, into a Marvion Skies with a Bounding Demagon, into a Reaping Blade, or something like this, I personally just find the card really useful, really powerful, really flexible. It converts to 3 on defense. You can always arsenal it and just send it for free. Um, if you end up having no better plays than this. So I personally think the card is very good. And then we're going to move into the yellow and blue. So you'll see I'm only playing Phantom Wraiths for the yellow and blue rune gates. So returning to what I said a bit earlier, I think the Deathly Whales, the rate is just not good enough. I think a 3 for 4 and a 3 for 5 ends up clunking up the deck very significantly. And because they are just inherently sent for a little bit less than the red one, you're much less likely to actually get the on-damage effect with those whales. We're not playing Vincent. We don't have access to the Shadow trigger to make our rune chant unpreventable and to ping ourselves. So the whales at most will give you 1 additional rune chant. And if you're sending a blue, I mean, most of the time people will AB, then they'll give you 1 block on equipment and a 3 block. So I found that it was much more useful to move towards the kind of yellow and blue Phantom Wraiths. They are much more flexible in terms of being 2 costs. It means they're much more easy to send from hand. It means that they combine with the Reaping Blade on a turn where you're pitching a blue to send things from hand. And they're also much more useful in your pitch stack. One of the things that Chane always ends up doing is right at the end of the game when you have 5 to 6 Soul Shackles, is you end up with this final turn and your challenge into most really powerful defensive decks is to try to convert that hand in a way where people cannot cover it. And so I found that the 2 costs are much better at this than the 3 costs. So this is kind of the reason why we ended up with these choices in the deck. In terms of then the rest of the blue base, we have Spellblade Assault, classic card. I'm run these in both blue and reds, as you'll see. I would count the reds more as a piece of rune chant generation, whereas the blues are a little bit more on the kind of blue base resource generation side. But obviously having blues which are able to generate rune chants, as you can see, is very good in the deck. It kind of insulates you from turns where you draw a lot of blues. A lot of the time when Chane starts sending full hands, your opponent has no choice but to start blocking. And they're just blocking until the end of the game. And so having hands that even if you miss on your Soul Shackles that you're able to convert, I think is very important. And as a happy bonus, all of these cards also block for 3. So Spellblade Assault, amazing turn 0 play. Generally very good in terms of being able to just empty your banished zone, send these really wide turns. The blues typically are more often blocked with or pitched, but if you're in turn 0, you're able to set up a Malefic and send a Spellblade Assault, you're very, very happy with this generally. Oath of the Arknight, this card was originally blue Putrid Stirrings, and I think I still really like blue Putrid Stirrings, but it ends up being too weak in the aggro matchups, because a lot of the time in those matchups what ended up happening was that you're blocking with a lot of your hand, you banish a blue Putrid, and you don't have the blue to play it from your banished zone. So unfortunately, despite me really liking the card and thinking it's very good, it was too much of a liability into Briar, into Ira, into Fi, into these kinds of decks where you're just never playing it and it's just ticking down in your banished zone every single turn. So that card ended up becoming Oath of the Arknight. It costs 2. You're almost always pitching or blocking with this card, but on the turns where you are given full tempo, sometimes the 1 rune chant really makes a difference. I think that's generally the trend I found with Chane when I was kind of testing and refining the deck and when we were playing lots of games, is that the difference between 1 and 2 rune chants is massive. And it's much easier to go from 1 to 2 than it is to go from 2 to 3. Then we have Hocus Pocus. Again, almost never play this card. It blocks or it pitches, except for turns where, for example, you have Malefics on board, you send it as your first thing just so you can send something from your banished zone to keep up the pressure and to continue kind of trying to resolve damage into a deck. I think we're going to talk about matchups and things a bit later, but one of the general tendencies of the deck is that once you get going, you have to keep going. You don't have the chance to go and then throttle off, because we don't have Deadwood Dirge in this format, for example. Once you start shackling, you have to keep shackling every turn. You have to keep sending every single turn. So then moving into the kind of rune chant generation package, as I said, red Spellblade Assault. It just happens to be 2 for 6 that also makes rune chants. It's kind of, if you count, I think rune chant and rune gate math is a bit fuzzy, but most people broadly agree that 1 rune chant is also 1 resource. 1 resource is 1 point, 1 rune chant is 1 point. So Spellblade Assault is kind of like a 2 for 8. if you squint. It's also split damage, and it's also allowing you to go wider than you normally would, because it's what allows you to play the kind of 5th and 6th and 7th card in your hand from your banish zone. So, I think it doesn't, the math doesn't map completely 100%, but I think it's a broadly true heuristic that I think is quite useful. The rest of the runechant generation, I ended up boiling down a lot of the runechant gen. So originally I was playing yellow read the runes and things like this, but I found one of the weaknesses of the deck is that it often ends up running too many 2-blocks. Once you start having to give up cards that you don't want to give up, your banish zone will get clogged up, you won't be able to play it, you die to blood debt, you die to having to block. So I tried to narrow it down as much as possible to the most powerful pieces. Read the Runes, classic card, fantastic with Chains of Hero ability. One of the best play patterns that you're going to have is into aggro, is that you block 3 cards, you chain, you play Read the Runes, and then you play a 3-cost for your banish zone. So you're effectively playing 1 card 9, 1 card 10. And these are the kinds of numbers that win SAge games, particularly into other really powerful decks. It's also a great setup card. It blocks 2, but you never want to block with this card. You always want to resolve it because runechants are just so powerful in this deck. It works into aggro, it works into fatigue, it works into mid-range. It's just great. And speaking of great, Malefic Incantation. I think this is amongst the best cards in the deck, if not the best card in the deck. I have here in my notes, 2 Malefics equals win. And I think that's a broadly true heuristic in the sense that once you have 2 Malefics on board and once you're able to make 2 runechants, what you often find is that you will have two costs in your banish zone. You send one, so you block with your entire hand. Just for sake of argument, let's say you block 12 with your entire hand. You have 2 costs in your banish zone. You send one, comes in for 2 runechants and 6, so that's 8. You make 2 more, you send another one for the same amount. You're blocking 12 and doing a 0-card 16. So obviously that's a little bit fantasy land because not everything attacks for this amount. Things are a little bit fuzzier, but it's a 28 value turn cycle where you're able to convert hands on defense and on offense. So one of the, I think, things that you need to learn when you're playing Chane, and one of the things that your reps will teach you, is that you want to preserve life so that you can resolve these cards. Malefic Incantation wins you games. These kinds of play patterns and being able to resolve your hands in this way just win you games because they create a completely unreasonable amount of value and split damage that the opponent just cannot deal with. And if they choose to fully block you, all of a sudden you're drawing up a full hand every single turn. Now you're able to resolve all of your other cards, and you're just able to cobble together these really unfair turns that I think are just incredibly difficult for people to be able to deal with. It's just a degree of offensive overlap. And once Chane starts rolling, if you have Malefics on board, Read the Runes, Morion Skies, all these cards just end up combining together to create these very powerful turns. Read the Runes also, and all of these cards also have an additional kind of synergy with Morion Skies, but we'll get on that in a second. And then to Arcane Cussing. I was very surprised to see in the Battle Hardened, I think I played into 4 or 5 other Chane decks, and a lot of them were not on Arcane Cussing. I think personally this card is incredibly powerful. It's essentially kind of Deadwood Dirge at home. It fulfills a variety of functions in the deck. So one of the most common things that you're going to do, you're going to play this card, you're going to pop it with a Bloodtorn Bodis, you're going to start your turn on 3 runechants, and then you've also made back the resource that you just used to play the Arcane Cussing. So it's not quite 0 cost, but if you're already pitching for something, if you have something that you want to play from hand, if you want to swing Reaping Blade after, these kinds of things, you find with Arcane Cussing that the resource curve becomes very smooth. And a piece of Go Again runechant generation is very, very powerful in this deck. It means you're not spending your Chain ability to play this card. You're just spending another card from hand. Another really common play pattern with this, particularly into the slower matchups, is that you will play this and then you'll send a Deathly Wail for, let's say you manage to stack 8 runechants, that's 8 and 6. So then they're in a position where they have to give you their entire hand and some equipment just to stop this from popping. And let's say they do this, you probably still have the Bodis online, you play that, and then you're able to send another massive attack. If they give you their entire thing because you play the Arcane Cussing, well, maybe you have a Morion Skies in your hand somewhere, so now you play this, they can't block it, they eat it, you get the 3 additional runechants, which, speaking of, moving away from the kind of runechant generation package, Morion Skies in red, of course, classic Runeblade card, it's really good. In a deck like this that presents turns that are very difficult for the opponent to deal with, what you're often going to find is that you have turns where you can fake whether or not you're holding a Morvian Skies or a Read the Runes or some other piece of rune chant generation in your hand. So you're sending the initial attack with the chain activation, and then your opponent has to decide if they want to full block this, if they want to take no damage here because they think they can fatigue you. Well, then they're risking the Morvian Skies into the second rune gate or into the Bounding Demigon, which then makes you just an absurd amount of value in rune chants, because then usually you'll be able to send another 3 cost after that. So it creates very unreasonable situations for the opponent where they are forced to either commit heavily and then risk getting blown out by Morvian Skies, or they don't commit, they save their blocking cards, then you play Read the Runes and you pass. And all of a sudden they're not really resolving a very powerful turn against you. So I think for obvious reasons, Morvian Skies is very good. It also helps you go 3 wide into the kind of turns where the turn where you usually need at least one of those kinds of 3/4 wide turns into the very, very defensive decks such as Oldhim, a little bit Flattering Showman, but that's kind of a difficult and weird matchup because of his hero ability. But play these in main board, really strong. Into aggro matchups, it also essentially demands a hand from the opponent. Into Azalea or into Briar, they generally typically don't want to block you because the longer the game goes, the more shackles you make, the more card advantage you get. You play Morvian Skies to send something, they're forced to kind of reset or to just eat an enormous amount of damage, and then you're going to force them to start blocking anyway. It's a kind of no-win. They don't really have a effective way to play around this if you're putting this on something that's 5 or 6 damage. 4 damage, you're risking getting blown out by D-React, but that's just kind of how the format is sometimes. So usually you would want to put this on a red Phantom Wraith, for example. We have 1 copy of Condemned to Slaughter. So as I said earlier, I found from my early testing that Envelop in Darkness and Besiege Demigon and cards like this were a little bit too conditional. They rely on you having X amount of things already in the banish zone. They block 2, so when they're not useful, they end up being not very good defensive options, and their floor is very low. And I think with the amount of rune chant generation, with the Spellblade Assaults, the Malefics, all of these things that we're playing in this deck, there's not really a need for the envelops. I think they end up being more trouble than they're worth. I think they usually end up gumming up your hands, making them a little bit harder to convert. So instead, we're just on 1 single Condemned to Slaughter. This card is here for a few reasons over those cards. Number 1, it doesn't say that it has to target a Runegate card on it. It just said Runeblade Attack. This even works on your Reaping Blade. So in an emergency where your opponent just gives you full tempo, you can just convert this regardless of what else is happening, because it will always work on Reaping Blade. Number 2 is because we're playing 2 Arcane Cussings. I would also mainboard this because I think it's important to have another way to pop the Cussing. So a lot of the times this is a good arsenal target if you haven't drawn or banished your second Arcane Cussing or even the first one. A lot of the times you'll pitch a blue for an Arcane Cussing, you'll Condemn to Slaughter, and then you're sending a Phantom Banshee for 3/10 with a Reaping Blade to follow up. Something like this. Very powerful hand, and a powerful hand that can just kind of ends up being a 3 card. If you have a blue in hand, Arcane Cussing, Condemn to Slaughter, and then you have a Banshee in the Banish Zone. So that's the 33 card main board. I would always play these cards more or less into every matchup. I think they form a pretty cohesive package. There are not too many 2 blocks here, particularly because we don't actually want to block with any of the 2 blocks. We want to resolve them all. We're never in a situation where these cards aren't useful. I mean, any of these cards here that block 2 are almost always useful. The only exception I would say is Arcane Cussing and Morvian Skies, but I think their ceiling justify their inclusion, and I think that if you have to block with them, it's okay. We have 4 2 blocks in the deck that you sometimes want to block with. Everything else you just want to resolve here. So then if we're moving on to the sideboard here, you'll see there are some interesting choices in terms of what we included for different specific matchups. So in any slow matchup, I would always play these 4 pieces of Rune Chant Generation. So we have Blessing of Occult. I think anyone who played Vincent before Rosetta is familiar with this card because we used to play it and played it with the Sonata Galaxia. I think it's fallen completely out of favor. I think maybe it was in some late Viserai builds that were just heavily playing the Sonata Galaxia style. And I think it was also in Stack Florian when that was a thing for a bit. But it's a 1 cost, makes 3 rune chants at the start of your turn, notably does not have go again. Luckily, we have a hero that just says that every rune blade or shadow action gets go again. So it's a really effective piece of stacking technology. It works great into all matchups where you don't think the opponent is going to swing very hard at you, because it also makes 3 at the start of your turn. You end up having a very easy time just stacking massive amounts of rune chants early on. Rune Blood Incantation, more or less the same. I prefer Blessing of Occult to Rune Blood Incantation, but there's not much rune chant generation that is actually Sage legal in terms of things which we can reasonably kind of use in these kinds of stacking matchups. And Rune Blood Incantation is fine. It's okay. I don't really like that it keeps taking over. I think some people run it in more aggro and mid-range matchups, but I personally just find it a bit too slow, and I would rather have explosive turns, and I would rather not rely on a kind of 2-block, 1 cost. I'd rather play an Arcane Cussing or something like this that just lets you burst down the opponent as fast as possible. Then we have a few other pieces here. So these are for other kind of heavy control matchups. I think it probably raises a little bit of an eyebrow that I'm playing 2 Putrid Stirrings with only 8 blues in the deck. But the Putrids are for extremely heavy control matchups. These are things you're never resolving in first cycle, only ever resolving in second cycle. Ideally, you're pitch stacking them, so you make sure you're banishing them on the second to last turn of the game when you have 5 Soul Shackles and you're just sending an enormous amount of damage. You make sure you draw a blue, you have a Putrid Stirrings, you have a few Malefics, you have a Morvion Skies, all these kinds of things, just to ensure that you are able to just stack these incredibly wide and tall turns. With a Banshee, this ends up being sending the Banshee for 12. It's just an excellent way to convert these kinds of late game hands where you are stacking and sending really unreasonable things. Typically in those matchups, you kind of chip them down throughout the game a little bit as well, because I think it's not realistic in a 20 life format to just stack the entire time. So this ends up being the kind of finishing blow where you're just presenting way too much damage for them to deal with. Yellow Morvion Skies works kind of similarly. It's a card that is just an additional piece of go again. If we could play a third red one, we would, but we can't, so we play a yellow one. It's there in case one of your first cycle shackles ends up hitting one of your Morv Skies, you have another one. And there, it's also a way of just being able to ensure that you have more go again for those powerful late game turns. And then we move into another reason why I think the deck is so incredibly powerful, and one of the things which I'm not expecting to last for very long whenever the Sage BNR announcement is made. So we have Reduce to Rune Chant. It's very interesting in a format where they decided to ban all of the generic D-reacts, except for the ones that are very conditional, to leave these in. I'm not sure why they did that, but they did. And these cards are so incredibly good at solving Chane's aggro matchups. So one of the issues with Chane is that because he takes a little bit of time to get going, because he needs to resolve lots of these chant generation cards for his engine to get online, he ends up being in a situation where a burn-up shock turn or just Fi's relentless pressure ends up kind of chipping him down until he starts having to block with cards, until he starts having to be unable to kind of resolve these really powerful turns. Reduce the Rune Chant in red and yellow kind of solves these problems. It's such a powerful card. You should always be ending your turn on a Rune Chant into aggro. I would probably say that most of the time it's not worth sending a Reaping Blade, even if you have the resources, if you know that these cards are still in your deck, because they are so incredibly good at negating your opponent's pressure. They make you a Rune Chant, so the red one is 4 value on block, 1 extra value on the Rune Chant itself, 1 extra value because the Rune Chant represents a resource. So if you have a single Malefic, if you're then able to send a 2-cost from your banner zone every single turn by putting a Reducer Rune Chant, going from the one you just made off to the Malefic up to 2, then you send a 2-cost, then you just cycle this over and over so that you're able to continue activating Chane to make more Soul Shackles, to accelerate. You're able to block and prevent your opponent from chipping you down. You're able to send these 0-cost or 0-card plays from your banner zone. It's very powerful. It's powerful enough that we're also playing the yellows, which are slightly less good, but they block 3 instead of 4, so they're just worth 5 value instead of 6. But also because they pitch for 2, they actually end up being quite good in the situations where you're missing on your shackles and you're able to send your 2 costs from hand, things like this. Again, this is still a 20 life format, and the aggro decks are no good at blocking. They're really bad at blocking. So if they ever give you their full hand and you get full tempo, you're able to use this card to pitch for things from hand, just to try to get them down as fast as possible. Sigil of Suffering, I think, again, classic Runeblade card. I think it's less good than the Reduces, but it still blocks for 4, it still pings them for 1, it's still a 5 value react in the matchups where they are unlikely. They don't really bring AB into you, and if they do, you're usually able to wait on this card until they've used up all the resources. I think there's very few decks in the game that you would bring this into that actually would have the resources to pitch for it. I think the Briars are now on 1 copy of Spellfray specifically for this card, which I think means that you need to watch out for this in case you're trying to block a Snatch or something similar with the Sigil of Suffering. But otherwise, it's a 4 block that pings them for 1 that they have a really hard time stopping. So it's just very, very good. And then we move into the 3 pieces here. These are just kind of general all-purpose slots that are don't fit into any specific category. We have Arcane Polarity. I was expecting a little bit of Icelander. I was scared of seeing a Kano. And I think you could consider running this in the mirror as well, although I personally don't, because I think it's more important to just be able to force cards out of their hand as soon as possible. But obviously Arcane Polarity, everybody knows this card. It's a great card. It heals you for 4. As long as you've taken some arcane damage into Kano or into Icelander, this might save your bacon late in the game because you're only on AB1. Pummel. I think that's one of the similarities with the Japanese list. I don't play 2 pummels because I think they're too conditional. I think you need to have the resources, you need to have the thing to send. I think they are generally very bad to draw. They kind of fall into the trap that I was talking about with Envelop and Beseech. However, being able to take 1 card from hand and do extra damage is really important into specific matchups. I think especially Azalea is one of the reasons why I included this 1 pummel. There's also my 1 loss in the Battle Hardened. Azalea is a deck that you don't have a huge amount of interaction with, but one of the really important things is that you try to take cards from their hand as much as possible. And Pummel obviously lets you do that because they're not going to block you. They're just going to do the Azalea thing with Death Dealer every single turn. So if you're able to take a card from hand, it's not just worth 4, it might be worth a lot more than that. And then we have Soul Reaping. So this is actually something I wasn't on originally, because as I said earlier, I think I wanted to raise the floor of the deck rather than raise its ceiling. But Marcus, my housemate, convinced me to try it and to keep it in, and I became convinced. I think it's such an incredibly powerful spike piece. There's a lot of text on Soul Reaping, but in a nutshell, instead of pitching for it, you can banish a card from hand. If you banish a card with Blood Debt, you gain 1 resource for each card with Blood Debt banished this way. And then there's some text about the attacking a hero with 1 or more cards in Soul, which never comes up in SAge. But what this is an unconditional 2-card 6. Even if you have no Blood Debt cards in hand, you don't need to banish a Blood Debt card. You can banish any card from hand, and it will pay for the card. And in matchups such as Briar or Ira, where it's important to stack your banish zone, because you generally don't have a lot of time in those matchups, it becomes an incredibly powerful turn 0 play. It becomes a really powerful, explosive go-wide play, where you're able to send a Soul Reaping with, let's say, 2 Malefics on board. You're banishing a Blood Debt card from hand, a Runegate card. Then you're able to send a Runegate card. Let's say you have one of the Morvion Skies as well. All of a sudden, you're going 3 wide, essentially starting with nothing in your banish zone. So it's just a very powerful spike card. I keep it in sideboard because there's certain matchups I don't really like it in. I think into the slower matchups, I personally found that it's a bit too clunky and it just ends up being a 3 block. And because it's a 40 card format, I was more inclined to play everything you see here on the side instead. So this is kind of the deck, the kind of principles that kind of guided us towards refining and constructing it in this way. I think there was a few interesting things that happened with matchups in Valencia. So I think thanks to the league that we had here, to the SAge army that we used to play at P9 Games, to just generally discussing the format and playing it with a lot of people in London, where we have actually a very strong community of players, is that we kind of were able to really accurately predict the meta. So one of the things I was a bit concerned about is that because I had played Chane for about a month or so before the Japanese tournament happened, I was a bit worried that now people have figured out how good Chane is. They know how good the deck is. They're going to prepare for it. But what actually ended up happening is that because this is a slightly leaner list, it's one that tries to resolve its hands much more aggressively. It's one that tries to tackle the aggro decks by essentially blocking them out and out aggroing them with the free cards that you get in your banish zone. I think a lot of people ended up preparing for the other version of the list, which I think was actually a kind of huge boost and benefit to the list that we were playing. I think it ended up catching some people off guard, and particularly in a lot of the mirrors, this list just goes one step faster than the Japanese list. So in the mirror, you generally end up forcing cards out of their hand before they are able to force cards out of your hand. What that means is that if let's say both of you draw a Malefic Incantation at the same time in the game, they have to block with theirs. They have to chuck some other cards in front. They just aren't able to generate these really powerful chain turns. And that's essentially the goal in the mirror. You want to get to that turn before your opponent gets to that turn. Some things are out of your control. What do you banish from a Soul Shackle? Do you draw your Rune Chant generation early? You know, of course, I think it's quite a high variance mirror. But I think it's also one that really rewards the player with the more reps, with the more experience on the deck, and particularly with the better macro and game plan in the deck building stage. Some of the other matchups we were expecting. Briar, as I said, we have 6 D-Reacts for Briar. I think that matchup is quite favored for Chane. I don't really have any specific numbers in mind, but I think I played 2 or 3 Briars. I ended up beating them all largely thanks to the defense reactions, the free cards from Banish, the way the deck kind of ends up interacting defensively to let you send free stuff from your Banish zone, and just sending unreasonable numbers, and then Briar has to start blocking, which she can't do, and she's not built to do in this format. There was also some concern about Ira, which is this really powerful kind of mid-range deck. I played into a Kodachi version. I played into a Edge of Autumn version, which I thought was very interesting. It was playing more powerful blues, and because it wasn't married to the idea of playing these zero-cost blues, so you could play more powerful blues. But in all of those matchups, you are essentially just able to block them out, stack, wait for your Soul Shackles to reach a critical point, and then once you start sending, they're generally just not able to deal with it, and you're able to fully resolve your hands. So, you know, of course, it's a 20 life format. You could get blown out. I was lucky enough to get good banishes off the top with my Soul Shackles. Things kind of worked out in all of these matchups, but I think as a kind of broad heuristic, the deck, I think, is quite well tuned into the meta, as it was and as I'm kind of expecting it to continue being until the release of Pen. I think the problematic matchups, there are a few which I don't think are represented. Enigma is actually quite bad for this deck, as we found out. That doesn't matter because no one's playing Enigma, because Enigma, I think, gets just run over by the other aggro decks in the format. But one thing I think, and who I'm expecting to be more represented, and is quite likely to win one of the Battle Hardens coming up, is Bravo, Flattering Showman, who I think presents a really interesting problem to the deck because he can fatigue you, but he can also smash your head in with evasive damage. And I would expect to be on Renounced Grandeur. That card completely destroys you if it's dominated. If it gets pummeled, it's very hard to deal with it. It turns off all of your aura token generation. So if you have a Blessing of Occult that's about to pop at the start of turn, but you get crushed by the Renounce, that goes away and you don't get your 3 rune chance. Because it was dominated, you probably weren't able to block with your hand. So all of a sudden you're looking at Read the Runes that does nothing. You're looking at not being able to send something because your Malefics will tick down, but they won't actually make any auras. So it's a very, I think, difficult matchup that requires you to thread the needle really closely. Between, for example, I bring the red reduced to rune chance into that matchup so I can give them an arsenal for a particular crush turn and things like this. But I think out of the matchups that the deck has, the Bravo is I think a top tier deck that presents a very interesting and very difficult problem for the deck to solve. Luckily, I only played into 1. It was in the top 8, and I was able to get over with my last card in deck with 1 damage into my opponent who was playing really, really well. And I think the only other thing to mention before we're getting into some of the other kind of general things about the format, I think the deck requires lots of reps. I think you need to have a sense both of how to pitch stack the deck, how to count your Soul Shackles and what you're banishing, how to ensure that you're setting up proper endgame turns that are very powerful, but also to get a sense of certain heuristics where, for example, taking damage to resolve a big turn is almost never correct before you have 3 Soul Shackles. It just was a general heuristic that probably interacts with lots of the kind of maths and the way the deck interacts, but as a broad kind of intuitive thing, taking damage from Ira, for example, to resolve a really big hand early will lose you the game because you haven't reached the level of acceleration, banishing, and free cards in hand to then be able to completely overpower her turn after turn. So it's almost always correct to block. 3 Soul Shackles tends to be the amount at which you can start really popping off. It means that you're likely to hit 1 rune gate every single turn. I think once you hit 4, depending on what you've seen in the deck, you're probably hitting 2. Of course, there's no guarantees. You're still playing a deck that just banishes stuff off the top. But as a general heuristic, and I think something worth keeping in mind, and something that will probably help you improve at the deck into these matchups, count how many Soul Shackles you have when you popped off, and I almost guarantee you'll have better luck in those matchups if you wait until you have at least 3. Other people might have different experiences with the deck, but that's the kind of heuristics that generally led me to success in the Battle Hardened. And I think that more or less wraps up the deck tech.
Thank you so much, Petter. That was an amazing deck tech. As now a somewhat big SAge player, obviously you won the Gold Code for League here, and now winning the Battle Hardened as well. Do you have any thoughts on the future of SAge and any thoughts on the world premiere that's going to happen in London in February 2026?
I do. I think it's very interesting. I'm very, very excited for the world premiere. I think that's going to be a really good time. I think having a SAge event, particularly when we're seeing all these new cards, is very exciting. I think there's also going to be, in fact, a Super Armor here on Tuesday, the 3rd of February. That's the one. I'll be here. Lots of good players will be here. I think there was some LSS Big Shot who's also going to be here with a bounty on his head. I think in general, I'm very excited because welcoming people to London will be really fun. I think we have a really, really strong community of players here. In general, we have obviously the people from Team Sigil and all these people who win very big events, but I think what a lot of people will find is that the level of the average players, such as myself, is actually very high. I think we're often playing into extremely skilled players. We're always trying to kind of sharpen and hone our skills against each other. I think people have a very sober understanding of the game. And I think there's just a huge appetite for improving and for competition in London. So I'm really looking forward to welcoming other people here. I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of defend our city. And I think in terms of the pen and the future of the format, I think they more or less said in the dev talk that they're not going to make any bans. They don't really consider it a real format until pen is out. I think that's probably fair. I think while the format is super fun to cook in and to play casually, I think at a high level, you end up with incredibly kind of stratified series of decks where there's about 4 to 5 to 6 really top tier decks that the other decks kind of can't compete with. You end up having Chane, Briar, Oldhim, Ira, Bravo, Flattering Showman, and kind of Azalea and sort of Fi, but they're a little bit bricky. And I think don't quite have the same like reliably powerful game plans. So what I would expect, I don't think the D-Reacts are going to continue to be legal. I think they just solve too many of Chane's problems. In fact, I think this hero in general has been a problem in every format he's ever been in. The reason for this is quite obvious. He gets Go Again and he gets additional cards. It's just such a powerful ability. He obviously wasn't designed with rune gates in mind. Those came in Dusk Till Dawn. So all of a sudden now he gets the ability to play pitchless cards, where his pitch is also damage. So Read the Runes being a kind of effect where you're essentially pitching a blue that also deals 3 split damage. That forces your opponent to give up a blue. It's just such a powerful effect. And then you move into the kind of Rosetta cards. Now you're looking at Malefic Incantations, Arcane Cussings, all of these cards that just create a kind of sequential overlap of Runechant generation where you're able to just have these massively wide turns. So my feelings on Pen and the future of SAge, I think, is that it seems like Pen in general is going to really shake up the format. The spoilers we've already seen, like the Magmatic Carapace, the Fi card, seem like they're going to do a lot for the heroes in the format. I think if that's the kind of power level that we're expecting, then I think we're going to likely see a very new meta. I think there are things that are going to be banned just because they represent a little bit too much of the kind of CC sort of blitz power level, such as reduced to rune chants and things like this. I don't think 0-card 6s really belong in SAge. And I think what we're likely to see is Guardian continuing to be very strong. I think particularly Flattering Showman has a really powerful ability. I think he's able to have a very flexible game plan. And I think it's actually really nice that Guardian has a format where they get to be really good. I think the rest will depend on what kind of LSS are intending for the format. I personally have high hopes for Icelander. I think the new D-React that we've seen from the London welcome package or whatever it is looks very, very powerful in Icelander. I think she in general is a very cool deck. One of our locals, Pontus here, plays it. And I was really impressed by the deck, and I think is at the moment just a few steps behind in terms of the numbers and the value. But I think if it's able to get a little bit of a boost, I think it's going to end up being very powerful. I think Fi is probably going to be very strong. I think Ira is going to continue to be strong just because Kodachis inherently present really problematic kind of turn cycles for you to deal with. It's hard to block them productively in a long game. Runegate or Runeblade, I think remains to be seen. I personally would like to see some better Earth decompose, for example, for Florian. I think at the moment, because we don't have root bounds in the format, you end up playing these, and you don't have fellings, you don't have plows, you end up playing these kind of quite poor decompose cards. So I think it would be cool to see some more broadly useful rares and commons in this format. And I think that there's a few other decks which could potentially be quite good depending on what we see in Pen. I think, for example, Hatchet's Dorinthia is actually surprisingly good in this format. I think OG Kasai, if she gets some sort of copper payoff, I think she could be really good. Obviously, there's no blood on her hands, as it probably shouldn't be. But if she gets a copper payoff, I think all of a sudden you're looking at a deck that might be able to produce really powerful turns and move towards a really powerful endgame. So I think it's quite hard to say, but I think it's very exciting. Obviously, I'll be now playing in the Calling. I'll be here at the Super Armory on the Tuesday. I'll be continuing to enjoy and play the format, and I'm very hopeful. I think it's fantastic. I think having a cheap format that people can just grab a precon off the shelf and join an armory and hopefully play at a competitive level, I think is an incredible thing for the game and precisely what it needs. I think that I really like the armory decks as a product, but I think there's a pretty clear difference between them and like a tuned CC deck. Well, hopefully, in the case of the SAge precons, that difference won't be so clear. A person will be able to walk in, grab a deck off the shelf, lay it out, start playing it. And while they'll obviously have a lot to learn because the game's very difficult and very complicated, I think that they won't have that difference in power level that sometimes is a bit demoralizing. So I think the format's very exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it.
Okay, amazing stuff, Petter. Hopefully we'll see you at the top tables for the world premiere. Thank you so much.
Thank you.